Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Kay Thompson, and this is A Lesson in Real Estate. Today's lesson is about practices that consumers of real estate today don't often hear about. While these practices have been made unlawful, the impacts of the practices have had lasting detrimental effects on American society, particularly Black people and other people of color. The practices have played an intricate role in segregating America's communities and also separating people of color from realizing what we are all taught to believe is one of the most important aspects of the American dream, and that is home ownership. These practices are known as redlining, blockbusting, and steering. As always, for the purposes of the lesson, I have found some definitions for these terms from reputable sources, that you can look up yourself. I give each definition along with its source. I will explain how these practices have played a role in America's segregation of its communities and explore some of the adverse and enduring impacts that the practices have had not only on our communities as a whole, but on people of color in particular. So let's begin with redlining. The Federal Reserve defines the term as the presumed practice of mortgage lenders of drawing red lines around portions of a map to indicate areas or communities in which they do not want to make loans. Redlining on a racial basis has been held by the courts to be illegal, and you can find this definition by going to www.federalreserve.gov and just typing in, the term redlining. Redlining actually stems from policies that were developed by the now defunct Homeowners Loan Corporation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was a government-sponsored corporation that was created as a part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It was started in 1993 with the purposes of refinancing home mortgages for white people that were in default in an effort to stave off massive foreclosures across the country, as well as develop more home ownership opportunities for these groups of people, or that particular group of people, I should say. Somewhere between 1931 and 1935, the Homeowners Loan Corporation used the practice of redlining to determine credit worthiness based on race. At least they started doing it between 1931 and 1935. This practice actually carried over well past that. The colors, the maps actually were color coded to help lenders, real estate appraisers, insurance providers, real estate agents, and others to identify areas where people presented the greatest credit risk. Those areas had high percentages of Black people and other people of color. And so these maps with the red ink being drawn around them created the result of people being systemically denied access to lending to purchase real estate or to refinance it. The property values in these redline areas have also historically been lower than similar homes for neighborhoods that were mostly white. The practice of redlining took place all over the United States. We often hear about segregation and discrimination is taking place mostly in the South, but this particular practice was done everywhere. You can see evidence of this by taking a look at some of the redlining maps that I took a look at, and they are actually kept in the National Archives. You can go to the National Archives and set up a free account for yourself, and you can look at some of these maps of your own volition. And they have some really telling information in there aside from the maps that go along with them to kind of help you see, just what the government was doing back then to keep people segregated. Some of the maps that I was able to take a look at include San Francisco, California, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, Baltimore, Maryland, Syracuse, New York, Washington, D.C., Memphis, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia. And so it's very important to look at those. And I'm pretty sure that if you go and just, take a quick look at them, or if you study them in more detail, you'll see that a lot of these areas that were redlined still have the same economic and sociological situations on in them that were going on back then. And when I mean back then, I mean, starting with 1931. The next term that I will provide a definition for is blockbusting. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, blockbusting means profiteering by inducing property owners to sell hastily and often at a loss, by appeals to fears of depressed values because of threatened minority encroachment, and then they resell at at higher prices or inflation. In other words, blockbusting is the practice of real estate professionals using fear to stoke homeowners into selling their properties for fear that someone of another race is going to come in, take over their communities, and as a result of that activity, that will bring down the property values for those that are already, living there. Once the seed had been planted that Black people and other people of color were going to decrease the property values by their mere presence, once that had taken root, it actually helped to create another practice commonly referred to as white flight. This practice of white flight is just, the moving of large numbers of white residents out of an area to areas that they deemed were, more conducive to their, lifestyle, culture, whatever, what have you. And when they did that, oftentimes, more often than not, actually, they took with them important revenues and resources that were needed to sustain the communities that they were leaving. And so that is something that still continues to happen today in a lot of major statistical areas. We still see that very much so. The final term that I will define for you is known as steering. Steering under the Fair Housing Act is the process of influencing a buyer's choice of communities based on the buyer's race, color, religion, gender, disability, familial status, or national origin. This is the practice of pointing a person interested in purchasing real estate in a direction of available property in communities where there's a concentration of other like individuals. So, for example, a real estate professional in the past may say to their client, you don't want to live in this neighborhood over here or this part of town. You really want to live in this part of town where there are more Jewish people or more Italians or more people like you. That area would be better for you. This is, some of the things that they would say back then. Or the real estate agent might refuse to show the client properties in areas that they prefer to look in simply because of their race. So either one of those things can be, is actually steering. It's actually illegal. And in some instances, very recently, we have seen that, some people have been brought to the carpet to task for committing that practice. The Fair Housing Act prohibits the practice of steering. And like I said before, it's primarily practiced by real estate agents. And very recently, a few weeks ago, the National Association of Realtors gave an apology to people of color and real estate professionals for allowing its members to engage in such acts like steering and other discriminatory practices, and has made a commitment to its members and their clients to stand against this and other discriminatory practices and to help stamp out discrimination in housing wherever it still exists. I stated in the beginning of this program that the Homeowners Loan Corporation was responsible for staving off massive foreclosures for white people in the time of its existence, as well as providing access to affordable housing for those people. One of the ways that the government did this was through the building of public housing projects. It has been long believed that public housing projects were designed to be housing that was meant for people of color. Actually, there's evidence that shows that public housing was really meant to provide fair and equitable, safe housing for people who were medium or middle income and low income people that were white. An example of where this happened was in near the Bay Area, just on the other side of Oakland. There was a city, and still is a city, known as Richmond, California. And it was a hotspot for employment during the Second World War. It was the home of shipyards where, white people were employed. They got good salaries building ships. Those ships were, used to, help stave off our enemies and to aid our allies in the war. And initially, these shipyards would only hire white men. Over time, though, as white men went off to fight in the war, the shipyards were faced with a shortage of workers. So eventually, they had to begin to hire others. So they started with hiring white women. Next, they moved on to hiring black men. And then they finally started to hire black women and others. People came from all over the country to get a shot at working in these shipyards because they really wanted to earn a decent living and, kind of get a leg up in life. Initially, the workers who came from out of state were staying in these old army barracks, which were, dilapidated in some instances, and they were, overall in need of repair. Over time, the old army barracks began to become integrated because they were hiring black people after some time. As a result, the federal government began building public housing projects in Richmond and making them available to only, white people. The white people began moving to the cleaner and newer public housing, while black people and other people of color were forced to remain in the old, dilapidated army barracks. As time went on, and the town of Richmond increased in population, the government started to raise up tract housing or subdivisions for the white people to move to, which of course they did. The blacks and other people of color were still struggling to find stable housing. And, over time they were allowed to move into this abandoned, white public housing. But before the housing was totally abandoned by white people, the government, realized that they had sort of a dilemma. They had all of these vacancies for, these white families in the public housing projects. And then they had lists, waiting lists from people of color who were trying to find fair and decent housing as well. So they eventually started to do some integration of the races. And what I mean by some integration is they would allow black people and white people to live in the same project, so to speak, but the black people had buildings and the white people had buildings. In one particular instance, through my research, I found that sometimes they would build public housing on one side of the street, public housing on the other side of that same street. They would label one side white housing and one side black housing and, housing for other people of color. A lot of times when you would, these people would stand in line to pay their rent at these public housing because sometimes, they did have reduced rents and, whatever their rent was, they had to pay it. So they would go to these pay windows, and you could tell that there was segregation even in the most liberal areas of California, which are now liberal, I should say. Because all of the white people would be at one window to pay, and all of the black people and other people of color would be at another window to pay, their rents for being in those same complexes. And so Richmond and other places like that in our history clearly show that policies and practices that were developed and implemented via the federal government actually allowed many people to violate the civil rights of people of color by using mediocre and biased systems to keep them from acquiring wealth through home ownership, And it also shows how easy it was for them to circumvent the fair housing laws and, to keep people, millions of people, at a certain, socioeconomic stage by, not only denying them access to those properties, denying them loans, or, charging them astronomical rates to obtain a loan. They also placed lower values on those properties where those people live simply because of their race. Even though all three of these practices, redlining, blockbusting, and steering, are illegal, the effects of the practices have not only created lasting physical segregation between the races, it has also set up untrue stereotypes about people of color. So usually when you go through a neighborhood that has a lot of blight or things of that nature, you assume that it's just because those people don't want to take care of those properties, or that they're lazy or whatever, what have you. When the truth of the matter is, it's just that when, a certain race left the neighborhood, the resources went with them, leaving those people unable to maintain or keep up those communities. And so white flight has over the years, and still in a lot of places still does, take away, those resources that communities of color need, such as, access to quality education, the availability of community services, such as, libraries and parks, and other things. And because of these practices, systemic segregation, segregation, communities with large numbers of people of color continue to deal with the lack of resources, for especially financial, that would make it possible for them to restore opportunity and growth in the communities. These practices also created excessive situations where, people of color were paying higher property taxes. Like I said before, they're paying more to borrow money to purchase real estate in these areas. And systemically, the values of those properties in these areas have been maintained at significantly lower amounts than properties that are similar in predominantly white neighborhoods. And they have ultimately contributed to the widening wealth gap between blacks and whites. If you look at the redlining maps for a lot of major metropolitan cities, where there are large numbers of black people, you might notice that these redline areas are still the areas where people of color mostly reside in these cities today. I definitely know that's the case for the city that I live in. In fact, research shows that Macon, Georgia, way back in the 30s, had 65% of its city be redlined. And that actually made it the most redlined state in the United States during that time. Over time, and specifically after Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made it possible for these corporations and other people to begin to be punished for the practices of redlining, blockbusting, and steering. That did more to, push people to stop blatantly using these practices. Technically, the practices were already deemed illegal based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which banned discrimination in the sale, transfer, lease, or use of real estate, property, and housing. So for at least the last 50 years, redlining has been deemed as an illegal practice. However, recently as last year, we've had several major banks, be accused of redlining, and a few of them have been found guilty of the practice. In addition to that, there have been some real estate brokerages, one which is very well known, that this year was accused of redlining and has pending cases in court that are awaiting litigation. After the economic crash of 2008, the federal government put in place a policy that required banks, credit unions, and other mortgage lenders to report more detailed lending data to show that they were not engaging in the aforementioned practices. The current federal administration has now made it easier for the fair housing laws to be violated by these lenders and other real estate professionals by taking away the Criminal Financial Protections Bureau power to enforce these policies with punishment. At first, the lenders only had to report race, zip code, and ethnicity of an applicant. The Dodd-Frank Act began to require lenders to also report the applicant's age, their credit score, and the interest rate that they were given at the time that they took out their mortgage in an effort to root out violators of the fair housing law. As a result of these practices, historically and today, and other things that have occurred, such as the literal running out of towns and even entire states like Oregon and Wyoming, blacks and other people of color, by doing things such as prohibiting blacks from owning land, selling a product or service, making it impossible for them to earn a living in these areas, having the properties be passed down through the, right of heirship was denied, and even imposing other restrictions, such as providing marriage certificates to prove that a black man and a white woman were or black man and a black woman were married before allowing them to live in a certain area, or preventing white people from moving to the same street as other families that were predominantly black. That those practices endured even after 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed, and still have, and they still contribute to the what we see in our communities today, these segregated communities in these most major metropolitan cities where there are large numbers of black people all over the country. Even today in most of these cities, white people live mostly in one part of town, and people of color live in other parts of town. They may work together. They may, go to the same city events such as concerts or museums, but then they actually retreat to their own respective areas, their own respective identified or assigned corners of the world, their worlds, when the festivities are over. The 2020 State of Housing in Black America report, which is one that was developed and is produced every year by the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. That's a real estate organization, a nonprofit organization that has historically been at the forefront and is currently at the forefront, for the fight for fair and affordable housing for all. That report shows that 60% or 62%, I should say, of the black population in this country is still concentrated in those 20 metropolitan statistical areas that have the most redlining. Because of these practices, people of color have had access to less education. They have had access to, less adequate health care and other things, and therefore have historically been left out of opportunities for higher paying jobs. And they oftentimes get stuck in these areas where there's a lack of resources and an opportunity to do better. In 2018, the median income for black households was 40% lower than the median income for white households. The Federal Reserve reported that same year that approximately 20% of black households have zero to negative wealth, compared to only 9% of white households. And a lot of that has to do with home ownership. Further, that study shows that that currently the average home values for black people were 45% lower, and that's right now, than they are for white homeowners. And in the same major metropolitan areas that I previously mentioned, black home values are lower than any other racial group. In fact, in MSAs such as Baltimore, Detroit, Memphis, and Cleveland, St. Louis, black home ownership rates are at or below average, and the home ownership gap between blacks and whites in these same areas is also pretty large, even though they are deemed to be some of the cheapest places in this country to own a home. There are other things that took place too, such as, we had African American veterans that fought in World War II. They did not apply for VA loans, which was their right, because they knew that they could not use those loans to purchase real estate in places that were predominantly, occupied by white people. So they just did not apply for the loans. So in my last few moments, I want to discuss what we can do to change this. Everyone needs to be aware of these three topics, or these three subjects or terms, and what they are. You need to be able to look for them. If you're a person that's looking to purchase a home and you're a person of color, it's very important for you to look for things that may point to, the fact that, your loan officer, real estate agent, or what have you, may be practicing these engaging in these practices, I should say. Make sure that you understand what you're signing before you sign it. Make sure that you are working with your local, state, and even national leaders to, create policies and to implement changes that increase integration, so that everyone can eventually have the same access to, schooling, job opportunities, civil services, civic services that every other community has. So, we have to do that ongoing. This thing has been going on for a really long time with, the fight for fair housing, and it's far from over. So I urge you to learn everything that you can about it. Make sure you go to www.nationalarchives.gov. You can go to www.hud.gov to find out more information about these terms and the history of housing in America. You can go to the National Archives to, again, check out some of these maps that I mentioned earlier. And finally, if you want to dig really, really deep into how these rules and other practices have kept America segregated based on color, then you can check out this really wonderful book. It's available either on Amazon or Audible. It's called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of Our Government, of How Our Government Segregated America. And it's written by Richard Rothstein. It is a real eye-opening book, and it actually taught me a lot of things that I was not aware of, and it changed my entire perspective on this topic. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me. My name again is Kate Thompson, and this is A Lesson in Real Estate. Until next time, take care and be safe.